All right, class, let's look at this data collection and sampling notes. The first part here we'll talk about in class, but I wanted to briefly go over the three different methods of collecting data. Three methods are direct observation, survey, and experiments. So these are all pretty intuitive. They're really nothing new here, but it's just a different way of thinking about different types of data. So direct observation, in this case, could come in actually a couple of different flavors. It could be that the researcher is actually observing something that's going on, and they're writing down what they see or what they observe. It could, if you're a company, direct observation could just be the data that is collected while you during your transactions or during your day, right? So I used to work for American Express, and every time someone swipes an American Express card, that is recorded in the archives of American Express data. That's direct observation. We're observing what's going on and it's being recorded. Anytime you go to websites, go to Amazon or whatever, something is being observed about where you go and what you click and what you do. So this is just called direct observation. So nothing's going on here. This is just sort of the natural, one way to think about it is just nature, observing nature, or really the behavior that happens in real life. Right? So sometimes this is called, you'll hear it called archival data. Archival, I'm not sure if that's how you spell archival. Archival data, let's put a squiggly line under there. That means misspelled. Archival data, which just means that it's recorded and stored somewhere. And sometimes it's really just observed. Like again, the grocery store might record every time you buy something with your little card. It might be recorded, but it might not actually be analyzed for quite a while. In which case, this sometimes is called secondary data. Secondary data, which means it was recorded for one reason, but perhaps used in a different reason. There is also primary data, which would mean that we're recording or observing the data for the purpose of our research, right? So if we're using secondary data or primary data, it's still both direct observation data usually, but secondary data is just sort of recorded and observed, for other reasons. So the next one is survey. So we've all taken surveys before. Surveys are not the same as direct observation, although they kind of are. But in this case, we actually ask people things, whereas in direct observation, we just see it. Right? We just see what's going on or record what's happening. So in surveys, we ask questions to participants. And we'll talk a little bit more about the advantages and disadvantages of each of these. But the last one here is experiments. So in an experiment, we create some sort of conditions or treatments. And the idea here is we want to see what happens in a controlled environment. All right, so we control environment and maybe just change one little aspect of something, one variable, right, and see what the consequence of that one change is on something else. Okay, so let's talk about sort of what's better of each of these. Advantages, disadvantages of all of them. So let's start out with experiments. So the advantage of experiments, and this is actually pretty good. Experiments are kind of, we would say, the gold standard for statistical analysis. And the reason why it's a gold standard is because it allows us to actually make causal claims. We'll talk about in a little bit about the difference between correlational claims and causal claims. Correlational claims just mean two things are related with one another, but we can't really say that one thing is caused by another thing. But experiments, we can actually see a before and after. We can say, if I made this change, it caused something else to happen. So that's the big advantage, is that we can make causal claims. Causal claims. Oh, that's supposed to be a C. Claims. This is a C. Causal claims. The disadvantage, though, is that it's oftentimes done in like a laboratory setting, or at least like an unreal setting, right? So it's not realistic. It's often not realistic. And you'll see in a minute that the advantage of one of these is, or the disadvantage of experiments is actually the advantage of observations. So because experiments are not realistic, what that really means is that we can't actually observe all of nature. Nature is pretty messy, and all kinds of things happen. In experiments, we try really hard to just really control all of that and just change one little thing. Well, in real life, that very rarely happens. Oftentimes, if you change one thing, there's a whole system effect. All kinds of other things change, right? So that's sort of the disadvantage of experiments. Still, again, the experiments are kind of the gold standard within data analysis. So let's jump up to direct observations then. So the advantage of a direct observation, like I just said, is the same as the disadvantage. The advantage is this is really nature. This is real life, real life. It's really happening. And we can actually see, what reality, right? Observe reality, as opposed to in a lab where we might not be able to observe it. The disadvantage is actually the same thing. It's pretty messy. So nature is messy. Let's put that down. Nature is just like my handwriting is messy. Nature is messy. And also the big one is that we can really only make correlational claims. Correlational claims. Which means that when it comes down to our statistical analysis and we want to say, well, we see that these two variables are correlated with one another, we can't say that a change in one thing is actually causing the other thing. Because oftentimes we'll see this quite a bit in class, that we don't have enough evidence to say that. In fact, all the evidence we have is correlational, depending on which data we have. So if we have direct observation, we can't do that. Finally, survey is kind of its own beast. The advantage of surveys is that we're able to ask questions that are hard to observe. All right, hard to observe, ask questions that are hard to observe. All right, so if we want to know someone's satisfaction with our service, sometimes we can see it on their faces, but oftentimes we can't, right? People are pretty good at hiding what they do, and they don't really sometimes tell us. If we have what we call a latent variable, which is like a hidden variable, something that we actually cannot observe, then one way to find it is through a survey. All right, so that's the advantage of surveys. The disadvantage of surveys is that the measurement tool itself, these questions that we're going to ask, can be interpreted in different ways for different people. It's not actually the easiest thing to create a survey for which we can measure things. So the disadvantage really, let's talk about, is measurement. There's possible measurement errors. And in surveys, in all of these, but in surveys in particular, we do a lot of sampling, and there can be sampling errors. And even just the development of the questions is not always easy and straightforward. All right, so that's where we're going to stop with this video, just to talk about these three different types of data that would be collected. Direct observation. Remember, that's where we just observe what's going on. It might be recorded. It could be sitting around for a really long time, and if we use it later on, we call it secondary or archival data. If we record it for our purpose, we call it primary data. It's not that important. Survey data is where we ask questions to participants, and these are usually sort of questions that we couldn't observe, right? And experiments is the gold standard. That's where we're going to create some sort of condition and treatment and control everything else, make one small change, and see what the effect is. All right, so we're going to stop right there.